Hello, and welcome to the Dissidents Podcast, where we talk about how we can strive for a world in which freedom and reason are at the forefront of all human society. We are launching our second ILV book club with a series of discussions of Jonathan Rauch's forthcoming book titled Cross Purposes: Christianity's Broken Bargain with Democracy by Brookings Institute Senior Fellow and best-selling author Jonathan Rauch. The book, made available to you by Yale University Press in early February, examines American pluralism and the role of religion in historical and modern democracy. Rauch, a self-described atheist, somewhat apologetically takes us on a journalistic and self-reflective tour of the intersection of religion and human nature. This book is a cultural, civic, and spiritual travelogue for believers and non-believers alike. Jonathan Rauch will join us for a live stream on February 5th at 7 p.m. Eastern. In the meantime, join Jen, Elizabeth, and Matt for 3 book club episodes focused on cross purposes. We begin our discussion with part 1, which is entitled Thin Religion. Remember to join us for the live meeting with Jonathan Rauch on February 5th at 7 p.m. Eastern. You'll find the link in the show notes, and you can find out more by going to the ilvalues.org website. Okay, so this is my first book club. Elizabeth, you've been running our book clubs before, but I'm really excited about this, and I'm excited that it's you, me, and Matt. So this book, Jonathan Rauch's book, Cross Purposes, I mean, he's writing this book as an atheist, saying that Christianity is necessary for democracy, that these two things go hand in hand. And the reason I'm excited about the 3 of us specifically, and then Elizabeth, if you can kind of walk us through, because you're the book club queen, is I'm coming to this conversation as a Christian, as a practicing Christian. You're coming from it, non-religious. I don't know if you would consider yourself atheist or agnostic, but I know you're not, not coming from a religious perspective. And then Matt is coming from it from someone who's part of the Church of Latter-day Saints, which we haven't gotten to, and we won't today, where Jonathan Rauch talks about LDS. And so when I saw that from the beginning that he was planning, kind of leading up to talking about LDS, I was like, oh, Matt, you need to be a part of this too. So anyways, right. Matt and I come from different religious backgrounds, but the same Christian tradition. And Elizabeth, you are not at all. So I mean, I just feel like this is going to be a really rich discussion. So with that, I'm going to stop and let you kind of, Elizabeth, walk us through the first part of the book, which is called Thin Christianity, for our book club today.
And we talked beforehand about how to divide this up. We weren't sure, and we just decided to go with the 3 sections that Rauch, outlined. So it is a little bit more maybe than Pam and I covered in our first book club, which anybody who hasn't listened should check out.
I'll put it in our notes.
So yeah, I think it's interesting. So in the we did not record our cold open, but I just already thought it was interesting that people noticed things that I didn't notice, because again, as you say, we're coming at this from different perspectives. I personally have 0 religious exposure, training, education. I've got nothing. So yeah. So he does start the book, Thin Christianity, and the subtitle is Faith's Crisis, Democracy's Peril. You know what? I really should have said, what did you think of the prologue? We really should talk about that for just a second. So he's writing basically like a little letter to his friend, right? And apologizing. And although I think probably all of us can think of someone that we maybe weren't as forgiving of or open to maybe as we wish we were. And so he really did grab me with the prologue.
Yeah. Well, I love the prologue because so much of what he said, when I had my conversation with Angel Eduardo about religion, I had not read the prologue yet. And so much in that letter to his friend actually showed up in our conversation, or, showed up in my conversation with Angel about grace and how, how we kind of approach grace and forgiveness. And so for me, it really struck me in that way. I was like, wow, I hadn't even read this yet when I had that conversation. So yeah, I identified with his roommate.
Mm-hmm. Oh, you identified with his roommate. Okay.
I identified with his roommate.
I identified more with him,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and for our
you,
list,
Matt?
Well, yeah, I probably identified more with his roommate. His roommate's probably, more like myself. So,
yeah.
And I mean, anytime you have somebody who describes themselves as an atheist, gay Jew, but also says, for a hopeful answer, we will look perhaps unexpectedly to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Boy, that got my attention. I was thinking, wow, where's this going to go? So,
yeah, it was the reason why I said, Matt, I mean, we were talking about you being a part of the book club anyways, but when I saw that in the prologue, I was like, well, absolutely. So we won't get to that part where he talks about LDS, today, but I can't wait to see what he says. But going back to the roommate, and Matt, maybe you identify similarly to me, here's one of the problems that I find with Christianity, and we'll get into this with both in Christianity and the what's the second show is Sharp Christianity, is why I identified with his roommate. So for our listeners who haven't read the book yet, because it hasn't come out, it comes out February 4th, and we're having a live stream with Jonathan Rauch on February 5th. But he's writing this letter to his roommate, who his roommate was Christian, he was atheist, and he, kind of poo-pooed his roommate.
And even made fun of him.
Yeah. And his roommate at one point, so Jonathan Rauch, identifying as gay and Jewish, Matt, as you just said, one time asked his roommate to sign like a petition on, something related to, gay Jewish rights or gay rights. Yeah. And the roommate signed it. And this blew Rauch away because he's like, but you're a Christian. And what the roommate said to him, and again, this is something that, I kind of was talking to Angel about, was that's not my place to judge though. Right? My only place is to love you. And I think that that's what's broken with so much of Christianity. And I think, this gets it into what Rauch's point is Christianity has kind of broken with some of those fundamental principles of just loving each other.
Yeah.
It's become so politicized, and that kind of gets us into kind of the first part of Rauch's book is Thin Christianity.
Right.
And I will say that I feel that from both of you, and I feel, how do I want to say this? I appreciate so much your openness and forgivingness of me. I think I am much more like John. I am more, I'm difficult. I'm not agreeable. I'm a more difficult person to get along with. And I don't tend to, I'm not as forgiving just in general of people. And, I get frustrated, with people more often. I can explain and forgive from, high up, right? As a psychologist, I can explain these things and everything. But in the moment, interpersonally, I feel your acceptance of me for who I am in a way that I don't know I'm capable of. I don't think that has anything necessarily to do with religion, but it might have something to do with it. So anyway, I appreciate that. And I notice it. So,
I'm just going to say that I think as well that I like what Rauch has done here, because you can sense his sincerity, at least through the prologue in the first chapter, but also that he isn't agreeable. So he is going to tell you what he thinks, and he isn't going to sugarcoat it. But the fact that he kind of speaks his mind, I mean, there's something that invites, confidence and a level of trust there. And there's an authenticity, and that's, mutual, Elizabeth, that, I think that you'll let me know what you think, and I appreciate that. You're not going to beat around the bush. And so that invites a little bit of, trust. We may be different, but we certainly have some mutual respect.
Yeah.
So his last line in the prologue is that, Mark, please accept this book as penitence for the dumbest thing that I ever wrote, and maybe for also the dumb things I said to you. So, anyway.
Can I highlight something else that I liked in here? That I may believe things about you I hope in a positive way, that you may not necessarily believe about yourself. And I don't expect you to adopt my beliefs or the things that I believe are tenets or elements of faith. That they're just some things that are different. And one of the things that he said that I really liked, when speaking about people of faith, he said, they receive frequencies I can't detect, which give their world a dimensionality, a layer of meaning that my world lacks. This does not make their worldview, your view, better or truer than mine, but I'm not defensive about likening my atheism to colorblindness, because faith is a part of human experience in which I do not share. And I just thought that was a really insightful way of just describing his own experience and acknowledging that there are differences, and that's one thing that I appreciate about what he's written, but also about my own faith, that I think it gives me a way of seeing things that's really helped me.
Okay, so now we'll start with part one. Then Christianity,
Very good.
Faith's crisis and democracy's peril. My first note. So he's covering research on what he calls the nuns, or, well, he didn't coin that phrase, but, what researchers are calling the nuns. I have no religion, people responding that they have no religion. The decline in participation, even if they have religion, they're not participating in religion. And, I wrote, a decline so great that their ability to maintain basic programs is in doubt. And as an academic, that is very salient to me, because we're seeing the same thing, right? Colleges are closing, and, so I resonate with that. So, again, then he says, within this trend is nested another. For some time, it appeared that the Christian devotional energy was shifting away from, sort of the moderate to white evangelical, but even that trend has not been sustained. So that's really the first section, is really about the decline in religion. And he does have, they were the citations that I looked up before I read this, so the same surveys and everything, so which he cites in here, and some books. So I think that we don't really get into, maybe until the end of the very first, right before Nietzsche's prophecy. He's really sort of summarizing there about stress, loneliness, current political divisions were some of the top reasons why people are either not participating, and even, he says, why some church leaders are feeling like they might leave. So I don't know about, again, I'm not attending services. So, are you recognizing these same kinds of things? Parishioners who bring culture wars with them to church?
Well, I have two things to say about that. First of all, actually, no, I don't notice that. Now, granted, because I've been in transition, I keep on going to different churches depending on where I'm at. But I've been surprised at how packed. I've been visiting a Catholic church with a friend of mine recently, and on a Saturday night, and the pews are packed. And to me, that brings me great hope. Now, that brings me to another point is, and I'll link to this in the show notes here, and I can't wait to talk to Jonathan about this, is I don't know if you all saw the Free Press recently just put out an article about this kind of reinvigoration of faith. So I've seen the numbers drop, but I would say actually in the last year, even maybe 2023-ish to 2 years, I would actually say people have realized that they are searching for something, and maybe they're in filling these church pews and they're not, they're just questioning and they're not necessarily devoted. But I've actually seen a resurgence in the churches that I've been visiting. So I'm really curious to see if these numbers, if he thinks these numbers might be changing, and literally within the past year to 2 years, since he's written.
So
Yeah.
you're nodding, Matt. You agree with that?
Oh yeah, definitely. And I mean, I'll speak for myself. I currently serve as clergy, as a bishop in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So I'm not speaking for the church when I say this, but in my particular congregation, it grows, all the time. And this is a congregation primarily focused on young single adults. And so, these are young people between the ages of 26 and 35. And we have new people coming every week. And there are, we are very sensitive to when people leave, and because that's a loss. And so, we're just naturally attuned to that and aware of that. And so while there are some who do leave the faith, it definitely is growing more than it is shrinking. But in terms of, pastors wanting to quit and, and kind of politicizing the faith, my faith specifically takes a neutral stance on religion, on politics. And so rarely, even during an election year, I hardly ever heard a reference to politics in church, at church. And so there's definitely a welcoming atmosphere to people who are different. And I don't necessarily see, I would agree with what Jennifer just mentioned, that there is kind of a resurgence, an interest in meaning and what he's describing here. I did, it does resonate with me to some degree. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we get deeper into the chapter, some of the other things that I think resonate, but definitely.
Well, there's two other things actually I was thinking as well. Elizabeth, I've mentioned to you several times this book I was reading, and it's by Tim Albert, and I'll put it in our show notes. I'm blanking on the name of it right now. But Tim Albert, and I think Rauch mentions this book, talks about the politicization of the church. And that book to me blew my mind. I mean, it was so, to me, it was antithetical to anything that was true Christianity. I mean, there were times that this Tim Albert, and he did a fabulous job doing research and going to some of these churches. Now, these are not the churches I've been to, but some of these churches where pastors are saying, let the state run go red like the blood of Jesus Christ. I mean, I threw up in my mouth. Like Jesus, there is no part of the Jesus that I know in my faith that would no, just no. And so I do think that is happening to a certain extent. I do think that where that's happening, it's highlighted more because that's a good story. And so I do think we're seeing the extremes out there, but the churches, I will preface that by saying during COVID, I was a deacon myself at a Presbyterian church. And during COVID, it became too political on the left side. And so we had a very young pastor who is a lovely human being. I mean, I know her heart is just, in all the right places, but it was very clear where she stood, and she preached from that, the pulpit on that. And that's where I was like, you know what? No. But since then, the other churches that I've gone to, I have not seen that. And again, this is post-COVID. So I know, Rauch probably started doing his research, around about the COVID area, but post-COVID, I would say, since I've started actually attending church again, despite what Tim Albert says in his book about, these horrible churches that have really become like basically MAGA, sanctuaries, if you truly MAGA sanctuaries, I haven't seen that. So anyways, okay,
Yes.
done.
Can I add something else?
Yeah.
Kind of an interesting intersection here is, being clergy, but I'm also a licensed clinical social worker. And so as a social worker, I was reading some of this and looking for parallels, not just in the church, but also in professionally.
Sure.
And burnout rates among social workers is quite high.
Mm-hmm.
And so while a lot of the things he was talking about was the people leaving the faith, I look at that in terms of also leaving my own profession, and how many people just get burned. And there's actually some interesting research on burnout, professional burnout among social workers, and seems to parallel what he's describing. And when you're trying to be helpful, you're trying to build some bridges, but as soon as you enter, well, I wouldn't say as soon as, but when you politicize your profession, when you politicize things, I think it does tend to polarize or invite polarization in some. And that polarization is very discouraging and creates distance. And I think that ultimately contributes to burnout.
And certainly I was seeing the same parallels in terms of education. And it's demoralizing really to in some ways, and that political conflict, and the ideological pull. So I wrote yikes next to this statement. Modern liberal societies rely on three linked social systems: liberal democracy to make political choices, market capitalism to make economic choices, and science and other forms of open critical exchange to make epistemic choices. That is, decisions about truth and knowledge. I wrote yikes next to that because I think that right now we have a crisis in all three of those. And so, I mean, like, again, in academia, I'm very sensitive to the epistemic crisis, right? That basically, the mistrust in science, the dislike, the impatience with the scientific process, that we basically live and breathe with replication and extension, right? We replicate something and we refine it and everything. And people think then that, oh, well, what you published before, what you found before, it turns out that was a lie, and now this is new, and what can we believe? And so there's no patience anymore with science. And I think that the market capitalism to make economic choices has just this has exploded, right? The focus on that, right, that's become the center. Maybe of people's attention and everything, and sort of the the liberal democracy to make political choices. I mean, that we're the Institute for Liberal Values. I mean, we talk all the time about about where we are with that. So so I don't know if you I
highlighted that. That got my attention as well. And certainly, if you take any of those three, and you amplify any one of those three, it can really create an imbalance and create some challenges. And so you need, I think, in a liberal democracy, you need those three elements of the market capitalism, the democracy itself, but also science. So.
Well, and correct me if I'm wrong if you read something different, but I think that's kind of where Rauch is going with where democracy and liberalism and Christianity make good allies, if you will, because there's this value system that kind of puts these classical liberal values, democracy, market capitalism, science, it kind of orders them in a way that is ordering versus just letting him, and what what I'm interpreting him saying in this chapter is that as Christianity declines, that value system has also just kind of been lost, and we are just these things, democracy, market capitalism, science, don't have any order anymore. And I mean,
the three-legged stool is, two-legged stool doesn't work.
Right. And keeping in mind, he's an atheist, right? So he's not saying, he's just saying that religion has played such a good, I mean, Christianity in particular has played such a nice role in balancing these out with, values. There's another part, I don't know if we want to jump to there now, but that I really found was really interesting was he was saying that their secularization does not provide purpose. So I think that this plays into what I was just saying, or no communal function. And he
Mm,
really that's why I really highlighted this communal function. Um, and that I think that's part of the breakdown too. Is there was a communal function built into the church. So as we're going through these, technology advances and whatnot, the church was still meant to kind of keep us there and tied together. And now we're just so um, atomized.
Yeah, I mean he's citing um Nietzsche, but he says, Christianity, it seems to me, is still needed by most people,
Mhm,
and
mhm.
um so, but also, God is dead and we have killed him. Uh, and my parents were telling me that there was a whole "God is dead" movement,
Mhm.
which of course I didn't know don't know anything
right.
about, but somebody that eventually became a religious leader of some sort had sent them they were laughing about how they had gotten a holiday card from this person years before that said God is dead. My mother, like, remembers getting this, holiday card, and opens it up and it says God is dead. And then later on, they learned that, he studied, religion. He became you know, some, he went and got an advanced degree in religion
Mhm.
and you know, pursued that. So,
When,
so I don't
when,
know anything about that movement. Do you know anything about the whole
well,
God
it's
is dead
interesting
thing?
to say that because just yesterday, my administrative assistant came into my office and was talking to me, and she's in her 70s, and she told me that she went up to the mail once when she was a kid and got this Time magazine, brought it in, and said, God is dead, and it sparked something in her. And she was talking about her favorite, Christmas carol, the I heard the bells on Christmas Day, that talks a little bit about Wadsworth Longfellow's sense that that there is that God is not dead. So anyway, I think it does. They're just things that pendulate a little bit, that go back and forth, and some things that may punctuate God in some may invite reflection and connection with God for others.
Well, I mean, when I read that, one of the things that, and what we had talked about, when I talked about with my parents, is at some point, have we explained so much that is mysterious about the way the world works, that that God is less necessary for most people. So this idea that, Christianity, it seems to me, is still needed by most people, and in this case, Nietzsche wrote, in old Europe even today. Um, is it less necessary because we don't have to I mean, we had mythology, right? Like,
Yeah.
Zeus is angry, which is why there's, the do we need religion less because we understand more? We understand the weather. We understand, maybe we're, uh, I don't know, like I feel like, the world doesn't care about me, So I mean, maybe I care about me most of the time, but the world doesn't care. And I don't
Mm-hmm.
expect the world to care about me. Um, I don't expect there to be a God that cares about me. And so I don't know. I just wondered about that, because that's what I think of when I read, like, God is dead and we have killed him. Have we basically, scienced our way, um, you know, um, out of God? I don't know. Have we?
Well, I think to some degree that there's this evolution of comfort, of security, that the world is a much more it's more comfortable than it's ever been in the
Hmm.
history of humankind.
Mhm.
It's more stable in some ways. It's more secure in many ways. There, despite the fact that two significant wars have erupted in the last few years. Uh, you know, you look at some of the things that Steven Pinker talks a little bit about. That this is one of the more stable times in the history of the world. And so when there is not that something that's sparking a need within you, oftentimes it is easy to get lulled into carnal security, into security of stability, where you just feel very comfortable and you're not turning your heart and your mind towards the divine and so forth. It's easier to forget it then. So I think
Yeah.
there's something to that.
Yes, and though I feel like we haven't been in a war. We are so comfortable, and yet, and Rauch mentions this, our level of depression
Yes.
is skyrocketed, and he talks about it, and it's this quote is attributed God-shaped hole to someone else, and I don't remember who said that first, but he mentions this God-shaped hole, and a lot of that is we have got everything that we could want, and we still want.
Exactly.
Why do we still want? And I think that's the God-shaped hole. At least that's how I personally feel. But I think that's what that Rauch is saying too, is that again, there's no, even if you're not religious, there's no structure in this world, even if we're not fighting. We've just kind of gone haywire.
Mm-hmm.
Even in our secure, safe systems, that we are still searching, even searching more so, I would say, than even before.
Agreed. That there's something within all of us that needs meaning, that needs purpose. And to some degree, the struggle gives us purpose. And when we're not struggling, sometimes we don't experience some of the dopamine hits that when you overcome the struggle, when you hit some of the goals or the achievements that you're looking for, you don't get that. And so when you've been when you've grown up secure with food with food on the table,
Mm-hmm.
roof over your head,
Mm-hmm.
living comfortably for so long, it is easy to forget things outside of yourself.
Yeah.
It
And so everything, I mean, when we're dealing with social media, everything feels like a struggle, It's like we escalate because we are not in a, wartime situation.
Yeah. Well, it's easier to get out of our mind. It's
Right.
get out of our life and out of our connections, whereas it's really easy to get lost in your thoughts and in your mind there.
Well, and that is what our brain was, I mean, evolution has prepared us
Exactly.
to constantly look for threats in the environment.
Right.
So it's a really good system for a bad environment, and it's not a very good system for a good environment. And so, so we say, oh, it's terrible that we're more depressed and, we're more anxious and that kind of stuff. I don't, fear is actually, sort of like, like the shark is, you're like a little goldfish and the shark is going to eat you, like that's, legitimate fear, right? And anxiety is when you're like worried that there might be a shark out there somewhere, and that kind of thing. And I think, as you were pointing out, like when there are fewer sharks circling us, then, that part of our brain is still going to worry about the potentiality of, of these things. And so, so we've named it anxiety. We had to create a new name for this because the saber-toothed tiger isn't going to eat us anymore. Right. But are we spending more time, more brain energy, really on fear-based thoughts, concerns? I would say probably not. I don't think we're spending more time preventing bad things from happening to us, or thinking about how to prevent bad things from happening to us. I suspect that we're not, but we're just doing it now in this in a way that you think about, like things that that are so unlikely to happen. And frankly, the things that we do worry about, most of the time they don't happen, but other things happen to us. And we also create this sort of like this loop where it's like, well, maybe if I'd worried about that, it wouldn't have like the worrying, somehow you get lulled into thinking that the worrying is protective, right? And so then something random happens to you and you think, oh my gosh, I should have I should have been thinking about that too, where I think before, historically before, not in our time, we didn't have the luxury of doing that because there was another real, true danger, whether that was getting cut, that could get infected and we would die. For heaven's sakes, childbirth. So I don't know if we're really spending more of our, I don't know, neurological energy on fear and
But I
anxiety.
think anxiety, I would say anxiety for sure, maybe not fear, but we have translated
Right.
anxiety as fear. And so
Yeah.
the result is still the same, is what I would say.
Yeah. That we are living as if we are living in a dangerous world.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Well,
And I'm
and
not sure
then-
we're capable of not.
Right.
That's, I guess, my point.
Exactly. And so that's when politics enters into the play and politics becomes the center of your life, and that fear combined with the political centrality, that just invites polarization.
Mhm.
That is what creates a lot of distance. And if you don't have the institutions of faith and family and science and democracy, you don't have those things that invite some interdependent relationships, the questioning, the answering, the giving and receiving, the parent children, then children parent life cycle, then there is some destabilization that happens. On page 15, he says, as America has secularized over the past 50 years, it's the last paragraph right before all religion. He says, disdain for institutions and discontent with public life have risen. He talks about a survey that showed that the percentage of Americans saying religion is very important to them has declined. So have the percentages of those characterizing patriotism, community involvement, and having children as very important. What value tested by pollsters rose in the importance over that period of time? Just one thing: making money. So just the secularism, the materialism, those things seem to well, Elizabeth, I don't know if you know what the research is on that, but it would be interesting to see if there's some correlations between those two.
Well, and he
Yeah.
also says, related to that, democracy pushes people to brutish materialism. But again, the attenuating factor is faith, religion. That's where he's saying again, without that, there is this brutishness. I mean, we do kind of become Hobbesian, if you will.
Yep.
Well, money is what buys us the things that we need. If you look at, the, sort of the basic needs, right? Shelter, food. I mean,
Yeah.
So we're focused on money, but that's because it buys us the things that we need.
Yeah.
So Maslow's hierarchy of needs,
Exactly.
So
But again, when it transcends into this, what he says, brutish materialism, that's not that, we're past Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I mean, this is becoming greed. And again, our values. I mean, going back to values, our values get kind of topsy-turvy.
Yeah. So the next section is called alt religion. So one of the things that I wrote, so on the next page, so at the top of page 16, he says, that said, it has become pretty evident that secularism has not been able to fill what has been called the God-shaped hole. That's what you mentioned, Jen.
Mm-hmm.
And then because the quest for spirituality and meaning is deeply human. And I crossed out spirituality and. I do believe that the quest for meaning is deeply human. And I do think that that's relevant, that's related to survival. I mean, our job from day one, that we're living on this earth is to, to learn to predict and eventually control our environment. That's what's related to survival. And so meaning, I'm thinking about this in terms of, cause and effect, in terms of psychology, if this, then that. There is when there, there's lightning, there's, like thunder, so long after, oh, well, there's, which comes, now I see which one comes first, kind of thing. And so this quest for meaning, I do believe is deeply human. I don't equate that with spirituality.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that. Spirituality, maybe it's into the semantics or definitions here,
Mhm.
but spirituality is a connection to the divine, and a connection, seeing the divine in each other. The namaste, the divine in me sees the divine in you. And that's what I
Is
was
that
talking
what
about.
namaste means?
Mhm.
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah, giving and receiving, and yeah. And so that's what I was talking about earlier, how I don't expect you to necessarily adopt my beliefs, but that's what I believe. Is I believe that you and I are brother and sisters, that we are each children of the divine, and so it's about that connection. And so that spirituality is about a connection with the God, with the divine, and therefore there are two important things that we do throughout our lives. One is to love God, and one is to love each other. And if you don't believe in God, then I hope you can love each other.
Mhm.
But that's what that's that kind of that God-shaped pull that he referenced here on page 16.
I just don't see, I don't see, yeah, I don't see again, I'm looking at it from a psychological
So
perspective.
meaning, but what
Yeah.
about connection? Do you believe that humans are biologically wired to connect?
Um, yeah, I mean, but so are other animals also. I mean, that, society, we create, society in ways that other animals don't, but
Mm-hmm.
other animals do create society for, for good reason. And we've evolved because, of our ability to, come together to protect one another
And it's the
and
complexity. It's
right.
the complexity of humans that I don't know that other animals have a
No.
sense of the divine.
No, because just
Mhm.
like what's happening here, right? Like
Right.
animals aren't like, that's what social cognition is, right? Like there's my own cognition, but now I'm trying to figure out what you're thinking.
Yeah.
Trying to think about what I'm thinking, and then we're trying to, come together on, talk about those things. And so no other animals, do that. But sure, like that, the division of labor and the way that, that all of that is, that those connections. I don't necessarily see the spirituality of that as all that, important, but I do definitely see you know, the advantages of human connections. I see a lot of disadvantages of human connections. Also. That's
But I think in Christian faith and tradition, connection is like that is a product of the divine. That we are meant to connect with each other and with our God. And so spirituality is almost synonymous in this way with connection.
Mm.
So that's interesting, though. It's so interesting hearing from you, Elizabeth, because I just took that as a given in the way that I just how I perceived it.
yeah.
Yeah.
So he is talking about new religions. So he talks about wellness culture,
Hmm.
so all
Hmm.
that, I mean, that's a huge thing, right? Like, I mean, so a lot of these, you were saying like, oh, there's been like this resurgence in religion, and I would use some of that religion in air quotes, right? And what are they doing? They're hawking vitamins and shakes and, whatever, juice things and all that kind of stuff. Yoga, namaste. There is a whole culture, right, around, that, not just going to a yoga class at the Y, but actually, the occult, Wicca. He does mention radical social justice or wokeness. I don't know what techno-utopianism is. I have no idea what that is. I should have looked that up, I guess. But he also mentions MAGA and QAnon and other sort of, quasi-religious kinds of things. And I don't know what you think about that. Maybe people have been drawn to some of those things, for the same reasons, right? That maybe that, the spirituality, but also the regimentation, right? Like, I will say that going to church, so especially you mentioned Catholicism, especially going to a Catholic service, I love that, you're all standing up at the same time and you're all sitting down at the same time. And there's a ritual to it that I like that feeling, which maybe this is what you're talking about, Matt. I like that feeling for that millisecond, even, that we are all one, that we are all doing, like, even though I'm not necessarily there for the God, right? But just this idea that we're all we're moving as one, we're singing as one, we're kneeling as one. It doesn't have anything to do with like a religion for me, but just this feeling of being on the same page, even if it's just for that tiniest fraction of a second.
Yeah. It's your willingness to acknowledge that is a great thing, I think, Elizabeth, because even though you may believe you have a different belief set about what that's about than I do, I still think there's value in recognizing value itself, rather than saying that there's no value, that there are no values, or there's no value in having values. I think that's really, that's the essence of some of the things that we're talking about, of the divine within us, whether you call that God or something else. Something
so you can get that from yoga, or like a wellness culture, or some of you can.
Well, he says right here, this is, what is this page? Oh darn, sorry.
Well, he says you can't, but I'm saying that feeling that I was talking about, like if we're all doing the same pose at the same time, same tree pose, right? Or whatever.
Something you can get from that. But then he says on 17, secular pseudo-religions also do not seem to replicate the positive effects of the real thing. And he talks, then he goes on to describe that. And so this is where faith really comes into play, that there are inherent benefits of belief, of faith. And that's where it's really hard for somebody who doesn't have the experience because you can't really fake, well, I guess you can want to believe, you can desire to believe. And there's a part of us that doesn't believe them. And so it's like, the guy that brings his sick son to Jesus and says, heal him, and Jesus says everything can happen to those who believe. And he says, Lord, I believe, help on mine unbelief. Well, we're all like that. None of us have a perfect belief, but to the degree that we have some belief in something. And if you can just say, well, I have this experience with connecting with people, whether it's doing yoga or standing and, ritual, going through a ritual in mass, there's something there. And what you choose to believe about that is ultimately about agency and about getting to choose what that means to you. And that can't be forced on anyone.
So, y'all, I am going to have to go in a couple minutes, and I hope you carry this on. So even if I'm gone, but I want to make sure to talk about that he mentions that there's 4 questions. He says, mortality. How can life have meaning if all it leads to is death? Morality. What is the basis for belief in right and wrong? Murder. Why is the world full of suffering and injustice? And miracles. How can we explain the world without magic? And he says that secularism cannot deal with mortality, and morality. They can't transcend meaning and purpose, which transcends oblivion. But the religious, Christianity can't seem to answer murder and miracles. Did that resonate with you both? Those 4 questions?
Yeah. Well, it was an interesting, to me, it was interesting, because in terms of mortality, death essentially undermines meaning from a purely secular scientific viewpoint. Yet, if you have an intergenerational kind of intermortal, meaning that you believe in a premortal, mortal, and postmortal experience or existence, then experience infuses mortality and death with meaning. And so the need and the benefit of the improvable, the improvable, in other words, you can't prove these things, the unempirical, then some of these unverifiable things emerge. Like you can't prove. I don't think you can prove empirically in postmortal experiences or premortal experiences or some of these spiritual things that they're very difficult, I think, to prove from an empirical perspective. So I think there are ways that those things can be mitigated through faith.
Well, see, what struck me there is I just finished reading one of Tim Keller, and Rauch mentions Tim Keller, but Tim Keller has a book on suffering that I'll link to in here. And with the things that I've been through in the past, some suffering. It's not murder per se, but suffering with end of life and whatnot. So answering that question, why is the world full of suffering and injustice? And I feel like Tim Keller really, and Matt, you touched on this very early in our conversation, like without suffering, we don't really, this is where we there's no purpose. There is some, this is a much longer conversation for another time, maybe, that we can, carry on. But without some sort of suffering or struggle, there is a lack of purpose and meaning. And so when he said that, religion can't answer that question, I don't know. I really felt like in my search for understanding my suffering, I actually, when I leaned into my religion even more, leaned into my faith, I did feel like, it wasn't like this answer, like, this is why you suffer and this is why your sister died on this and this date and you'll see this, and it wasn't like that. But I do feel like, there was, and I think it's probably too deep for this, but I do feel like suffering is baked into the Christian faith. Jesus Christ suffered. His whole life was suffering. So to expect us to just be like, this, this is a cakewalk, is kind of ignorant.
Yeah. Well, without suffering, there's no opposition. With no opposition, there's no choice. So there's no choice. If you don't have choices, then you are not evolving yourself. You're not growing. You're not learning. You're not developing. And that in and of itself creates some meaning. And so, a God who would eliminate all suffering essentially eliminates our ability to make choices. We just become mechanical, robots, if you will. I don't know if there's a different way of looking at that, if you have some different perspectives on that, but I think you ultimately have to be able to make some choices, and suffering is one of those things where one of the things you learn is you learn from experience, right, wrong, good, evil, things that work, things that don't work, only through experience, only through suffering, through the disappointments of failure, but also success.
Not good enough for me.
All right.
No, no. And that's just, like, I agree. Like, there's time, like maybe, I don't have children, but, you sometimes you have to let my students, suffer, right? It's like, well, maybe you learned something from this, right? So I get that. But I don't think, some of it's like, that's not what I would hope that a God would be. And I certainly don't think that that's what we hope, that, parents or teachers will let someone suffer indefinitely, or, there's like this, there is learning in, so like punishment, for example, there's usefulness in punishment because you punish and then you're forgiven. Right. But once the punishment is over, that's the point of the punishment. You're punished and then we move on. Right. And then there's not punishing. It's like shame. You should be ashamed of yourself. You say to your kid, you should be ashamed of yourself. You want that to be lasting, right? You want that to be remembered. I was ashamed of myself. People thought, my parent was ashamed of me when I hit my little sister, who was too small to, defend. You don't hit little girls, or you don't hit your sister or whatever. You should be ashamed of yourself. There's no, you don't do punishment for that. You let that resonate. But you're talking about, he's talking about bigger things here,
Sure.
6 million people dying,
Mhm.
and I just can't, I'm with the author. I can't reconcile that. That's
Mhm.
not something that I can reconcile with a God, or with, well, then then you have choice or whatever. Well, you know what? I didn't make the choice to be here. Somebody else made that choice before I got here. I'm stuck with it. And, what, is that, I'm making a choice every day, I guess, to stick with it. But, I, that wasn't a choice that we each made. Somebody made
Mhm.
that choice for us.
Sure.
And so, to make these, it's just, I'm with the author on that. Like, I just can't, I can't bridge that span.
Well, and that's the point. I think that's the point that he's trying to make, is that without faith, you can't bridge that. And so I'm not, by telling you that, I'm not expecting that you agree with me at all. It's just an acknowledgement that there are some certain things that faith does, that in order to make sense and to have some purpose, it just requires, it
Yeah.
requires an element of belief and an element of faith.
And so he's saying that most people believe that we're here for a reason,
Yeah.
which I do think is, he's contradicting himself a little bit here, right? Because he's
Yeah.
saying that most people don't have faith, have religion, Christianity, whatever, you
Sure.
know. And yet most people believe that we are here for a reason. I don't know. So, I don't know. So I found that contradictory for him to be saying like that, that he believes that most people believe we're here for a reason. That I found that a contradiction with his other
Sure.
comments, so.
Well, if you listen to, um, some of his other stuff, the Constitution of Knowledge and so forth, there's kind of a little bit of an interesting evolution, I think, from that to this book, at least to this chapter. And so I think, like everyone, we're all a work in progress, and so you're right. There may be a little bit of a contradiction there.
So you said you had another question.
Oh, I've got a few here. So, um, let's see. Page 27.
Okay.
All right. So down at the bottom, he says, now, speaking as an atheist and a scientific materialist, I do not believe religions actually answer that question. So the question, if there is no transcendent moral order anchored in a purposive universe, something like God-given laws, why must we not be nihilistic and despairing sociopaths? This is now, speaking as an atheistic and scientific materialist, I do not believe religions actually answer that question. Instead, they rely on a cheat.
Yeah,
Which,
I highlighted that. Yeah. Yeah.
oh, good. All right. Very good. That they call God. They assume that their conclusion by simply asserting the existence of a transcendent spiritual and moral order. They invent God and then claim that he solves the problem. Um, so that's the first thing. And he, in talking about this cheat, that God is a cheat, Well, you have to believe something. He's believing that God is a she. That's a belief. That's his faith.
I don't, so I also felt this contradiction also. And
Okay.
one of the things that I kept coming back to was he's saying, I'm an atheist, I'm an atheist, I'm an atheist, right? And yet he's saying, I don't need all of these things that supposedly religion provides people in order to behave morally. I'm a moral person
Yeah.
and don't need religion.
Yeah.
And so if he's a moral person and doesn't need religion, then why can't everyone else be, a moral people without religion? And
Sure.
so then, like you said, like, well, what is your religion? And I guess that's kind of what I was getting to when I was saying like yoga, like, for example, the ritualistic nature, and you were saying suffering,
Sure.
like working out, right? People who are,
Yeah.
who run, who
Correct.
lift weights, there is suffering, right? There is,
Price to pay.
and in pursuit of becoming faster or stronger or better or whatever, and
Yeah.
there's a ritualistic nature to that, right? And
Yeah.
then that can become the center for making other choices, right? Well, I'm not going to drink alcohol because I want to get bigger, stronger, faster, whatever. I'm going to eat healthier because those kinds of things. I'm going to engage with this group of people because I feel that, whether it's a knitting group, right? Like
Mhm.
this is something that, so I'm making choices based on this structure that I have given to myself.
Right.
And so that I'm not suggesting that's the same as religion, but I'm saying that you can get that same kind of structure and that same kind of feeling, like that sort of everybody's on the same page. Like we believe in something together,
Right.
whether that's knitting or, pumping iron or
Yep.
religion. And I also don't think that I need religion to think about morality and my choices. Um, I value feeling good about myself, but by being good to another person, I
Yeah.
guess.
Yeah.
I value that feeling. And I think that I recognize it more when I haven't had it in a while.
Mm.
So after being canceled, I felt very useless. Okay.
Mm.
So because I
Mm.
couldn't contribute at my university, which was big because I don't have kids, those were my kids,
Right.
and, all that kind of stuff. And so recently I took on another little job on campus. And just about a month in, I was I helped someone work
Mm.
through a really serious problem that was, was an academic problem, but it was,
Yeah.
it was kind of a big thing. And I felt that same joy again,
Right.
where I felt useful. And so it wasn't that I was uniquely qualified to help that person or that somebody
Yeah.
else couldn't have done it, but I felt useful. And
Okay.
so I think that behaving in some sort of moral, socially useful, socially productive kind of way,
Yeah.
feeling useful, not in service of a God, but in service of community, is
Right.
still something that I value and didn't
Yeah.
realize how much I was missing as I withdrew, not from religion, but withdrew
Mhm.
from that feeling like I had nothing to offer anymore.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, and I guess I think you can get that from other ways. And I think he's getting it from other ways because otherwise he wouldn't keep saying, but I'm an atheist
Yeah.
and I want to talk about morality.
And I don't sense that he's proselyting, and I hope that that's not the experience that you're having tonight. That what I sense is that this is more of an existential work that he's created, and it's just, and because it's more existential, then, he's just acknowledging that there is a different frequency. There's something there that I'm missing, but I'm okay with it. And I'm okay that he's okay with it. I'm okay with you and with your choices. I like our relationship. I like how we work together. I like some of the things that we're doing together. I'm not trying to change you, or at the same time, Elizabeth, I just my own sense. I mean, I feel this to my core. Just what you experienced by going back to work and helping someone, that, to me, there's you don't have to agree with this at all. There is something innately divine in you. There is something that, yes, you get you get that benefit, you get that connection, and I believe that is real, that is part of our humanity, that is part of our identity, and that's what I think is what is needed that we're trying to promote within the Institute for Liberal Values, where science is empiricism, things that are mutually understood and that can kind of draw us together, and reason, where we can talk things through and just reason together, talk together. I think that is what ultimately bridges us together, but helps me understand, all right, you don't believe it, but that's okay. You don't need
And
to
I
believe
think there's
it.
I think there's a selflessness to your perspective and a selfishness to my perspective. And to the, it's like he's writing, it's like, I'll write a book that will be, like for me, like, I'll feel a little bit of a selfishness. It's like, I got something out of that. I helped someone else. And so I think that it's more selfless for you and more selfish, maybe more self-focused for me, even though I working with other people and working for other people.
Yeah. And see, this is where I don't see those two things as different. I see them as interdependent. That when I cease to see you separate from me, that we're separate, and we acknowledge that separateness. But when your well-being is when I'm interested in your well-being, and I'm not going to put somebody else down, or I'm not going to step on somebody to elevate myself, that's what I think. I think that's the divine. That's what divine looks like. And I'm not perfect at that. I misstep all the time and have to, apologize and make mistakes. But I think that because I really like to have the experiences with you, and, I like to help others. Well, there's some, I get some real, dopamine hits for altruism as well. And so, these philosophical questions about, is altruism, ultimately selfish, or, that kind of a thing. Well, maybe it is. But ultimately, those things are beliefs. Are we ultimately selfish? Are we ultimately altruistic or selfless? Well, people have argued about those things for centuries. So anyway.
I actually wrote something. So at the end of this chapter, page 31 and 32, he's talking about, obviously many scientists are religious, and, how do they reconcile that? And I wrote, that my little note was, we have to find an acceptable level of hypocrisy. That's what I wrote on there, that we have to find it. It's like, okay, I'm comfortable with this hypocrisy in my, in my life. It's like, I'm doing things over here that don't necessarily agree with things I believe over here. And I'm just gonna accept that in myself, and like you said, in other people, and maybe that's a little bit of the miracle, right? That we can, that we can get through that. So,
well, he did say this. Let's see. The founding innovation of scientific revolution has to demand explanations which are empirical, impersonable, replicable, and therefore socially adjudicable. Thus placing magical thinking, including religious thinking, firmly out of bounds. In that way, belief in God, if God has any supernatural character, breaks the universe.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, looking at that, Well, what if the scientific method is simply a pattern of temporal revelation, where truth is revealed empirically, impersonally, replicably, and is adjudicated socially? It's just revelation. It's just a different form of revelation. And if we have a temporal revelation, isn't it also possible that, why can't truth also be revealed spiritually, that is unmeasurable, but personal, replicable, and socially adjudicated by divine beings, or, prophets, or, people who are some religious leaders, assuming that they are rooted in truth, and they're not, again, in not putting people down, not trying to dominate, that there are different ways that those things that are unmeasurable or undiscoverable based on where we're at right now, ultimately they may be discovered by, something spiritual. I think spiritual is something that happens within you that's unidentifiable, that, if you have a question that you're trying to answer, that comes from somewhere. Where does it come from? And then you do an experiment on it and you find truth and you discover truth. Well, that truth is a temporal truth that you can now measure, adjudicate socially, and you can replicate it, and you can say, well, this is truth. But, we didn't know these things hundreds or thousands of years ago. The use of a cell phone, 100 years ago, people would have thought that was crazy that we were able to do these things. But anyway, it was just
before we finish, I do want to, because he really doesn't until the end of the section define what he means by thin religion.
Yeah.
And so on page 33, he says, what I mean by thin religion is that it's too thin to provide meaning and morals to the culture, and thus to reliably support democratic society. So, and for me, like, until we got there, I didn't know where he was going with this sort of thin religion. Maybe because I don't have any, I wasn't sure what he meant. But yeah, so, too thin to provide meaning and morals to the culture, and thus to reliably support a democratic society. So he really is suggesting here that, religion has failed liberalism, right?
Yeah. If you engage in thin religion.
Right.
And then we'll learn about sharp religion, and I'm eager to hear what he says about thick religion. What does that mean?
Yeah.
That'll be good. I got to tell you one last thing.
Yes.
He starts quoting all these things about, John Adams said that, our Constitution, these quotes about our Constitution is insufficient to govern, anything but a moral and religious people, and all these kinds of things. And to some degree, that's true. Because one of the things that the United States of America has done is it's tapped into the natural self-governance that comes when somebody adopts a way of thinking, feeling, believing, and behaving. And then you don't have to spend a ton of, time and effort in trying to coerce and force and, get people to think, feel, believe, and behave in a certain way. So, there's a lot of efficiencies in having a natural freedom of, freedom of speech, freedom of thought, freedom of religion, and so forth. So anyway, what I wanted to say is when I was doing my undergrad, the last paper that I wrote in my policy class was about separation of church and state, history, and behavioral trends. And it just looked at how, some secular rulings by the Supreme Court and others, how the United States has become more secular. There are also some behavioral trends that that parallel that increase in secularization. So when I'm reading this first chapter, I'm thinking, all right, this guy's speaking my language, you know. This guy who's so different than I am, essentially, is writing something that I worked on over 30 years ago. That really,
Yeah.
I think, that there are definitely some similarities. So I appreciated that. I'm glad that somebody who's very different from me, it just was a pluralistic experience. And you and I've talked a little bit about that before, about how liberal values are essential for pluralism and giving people freedoms and opportunities to make choices. So.
And I really do think, so far, I really do think there's something for everybody in this book. It's not, again, somebody who, doesn't have religion. I'm identifying maybe more with his perspective.
Yeah.
I'm imagining maybe his perspective a little bit from where he's, and I appreciate his trying to see, through the lens of religion, as somebody who, who doesn't, who's not going to keep, he's not going to keep that lens up, maybe very long. So we'll see.
Exactly.
I'm interested in reading further, and I think it's.
I really am, because one of the things that I really like that he's done is that it's like, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and render unto God the things that are of God. By differentiating, saying that faith has its lane, reason, politics, science has their lane, and it's best to acknowledge those lanes and be careful about, be very cautious about moving one into the other.
Yeah, and he really is focused on, respecting that the mutual respect that
Right.
should be going on there. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. All right.
Okay. Thank you.
Hey, thank you, Elizabeth. This has been a great conversation. I've really enjoyed it.
Yeah, me too.